Hello everyone, Crystal Whetstone here. It's my pleasure to give you some background information on Argentina's period of state terrorism to help you better contextualize the film that you viewed for class. So I want to begin by taking a broader look at Latin America in general. Latin America is marked as an example of settler colonialism. So this is where a European power came in and settled the region, mainly Spain and Portugal. And then they stayed, right? So they ran the colonies and they created a very hierarchical system. We know that colonialism obviously disadvantages those who are under colonial rule. And so this system was really put in place in a way that racialized different categories of people. And so it's those who were the Spanish and Portuguese, and then later their descendants, who become the economic, social, and political elite by and large throughout the region. And then below these white European identified groups, we have a mix of others. So there's Ladino or Mestizo people who are characterized as having European and indigenous ancestry. The Zambo have indigenous and African ancestry. And then, of course, we just have some people who are characterized as indigenous and others as Afro-descendant. And it's just really important to stress how economically stratified these groups are and just how small the wealthy are in most parts of Latin America. A very small percentage of people who own much of the land. And so this leads to a lot of frustration, especially by those who are kept out of government. And this is well after the period of independence, which happens in about the early 1800s for most of Latin America. Argentina does have indigenous and Afro-descendant people. However, these are very small in terms of other countries in Latin America, and there's specific reasons for why that is. Official state policies actually targeted indigenous people through military campaigns to eradicate them. There were wars that were fought where they sent Afro-descendant people to the front lines, and this is what made these populations quite small. There's also been a very large influx of European immigrants to Argentina, especially Italians, that happened at the start of the earliest 20th century. And this was also a period of industrialization for Argentina. And what's notable about this is that many of these folks moved into factory work. But there's been this racializing language to characterize all working class poor people as somehow being black, right? They actually use a really offensive racial slur to talk about anyone who's working class, whether they're in fact black or not. So there is a lot of lingering racism in the country that the country still needs to deal with. Now, in terms of the period of state terrorism, this is all situated in the broader context of the Cold War. And the U.S. is, of course, concerned about its rival, the USSR, the Soviet Union, and it develops what we call its national security doctrine, which characterizes Latin America as the backyard of the U.S. And so whatever's going on in its backyard is the U.S.'s business. And what happens is, and the many governments in Latin America get on board with this idea, is that if you are someone who's on the political left, or you're someone who just believes in social justice, you are immediately assumed to be linked to the Soviet Union. And that then means you are a terrorist and a subversive. And in particular, there is something called Operation Condor. This was a U.S.-backed mission that provided training and arms to different non-democratic, basically military dictatorships throughout Latin America. And Argentina was one of these major countries. The other countries that participated that were major members were Uruguay, Chile, Paraguay, Bolivia, and Brazil. Later, Ecuador joined, and Peru was marginally involved in this. But basically, this whole construct is that people who are on the political left are enemies of the state, right? And so we must have a counterinsurgency to deal with these terrorists. And so at a place in Georgia called the U.S. School, well, actually it was in Panama. It's now in Georgia. So originally Panama, it's called the School of the Americas, and it taught methods of torture and killing, and it encouraged, right, taking away civil rights and civil liberties of those who are considered to be terrorists. It is now located in Georgia, and it's called the Western Hemisphere Institute for Security Cooperation, and they assert that they no longer teach methods of torture. However, security and military forces during this whole period of the U.S. national security doctrine would send their groups of the military and security forces to the School of the Americas for training. There's also something called liberation theology that comes about in this period, and I want to talk about it because it's raised a little bit in the film. So in the 1960s, the Roman Catholic Church reforms itself in a process that's referred to as Vatican II. And part of this is to say, you know what, yes, we want to focus on the next life. That's important to our understanding of our faith, but we also need to make sure that people have a nice life here on earth. And part of this is because Latin America is such, especially at that point, there was so much poverty for people who were outside of the elite. There was so much class inequality, and there still is a lot of class inequality throughout Latin America. So part of this was trying to just say that, yes, we need to have redistribution of the land so that people can actually grow enough food to feed themselves. So in part, this was a bit of a co-optation of different revolutionary movements that were sprouting up to take on basically dictatorships where people didn't have any way to have a voice in government. However, this is really more characteristic of Central America, and this was not the case in Argentina. This isn't to say that there weren't priests and nuns who took on these ideas of liberation theology and were working with human rights activists in Argentina. However, the Catholic Church as a whole was in collusion with the military dictatorship in this period. And so I think that really helps to contextualize that scene where the main character is in the confessional. And that's because the Roman Catholic Church in Argentina very much knew what was happening, but they supported the government. But this was certainly not the case in other Latin American countries where the Catholic Church was actually very integral to supporting human rights work. And I just want to go over briefly what was going on in Argentina prior to the seizure of power by the military in 1976. So after World War II, Juan Perón comes to power, and he exercised a corporatist model of governance to really cement his rule. So he had, stuff that he set aside for the military, stuff that he set aside for the business sector, and stuff that he set aside for the working classes, as well as those who were just very, very much in poverty. So he kept this going for a while. However, after World War II, the economic growth that Argentina had previously seen suddenly went dry. And it's at this point that Juan Perón also starts censoring the media. He starts attacking political rivals, and in some way foreshadowing the military dictatorship in the sense that, right, like these are bad people, they're not really Argentines, right? And so the military finally gets sick of Juan Perón's support for labor unions, and they overthrow him. So there's actually a military dictatorship that comes to power in 1955. And what they do is they ban political and civil rights. And so there's no space for people to organize except in, illegal guerrilla movement activity. So what happens is that there's actually an armed political left and an armed political right, and they're creating lots of violence in Argentina in this period, to the point where the military just says, okay, we're ready to call it quits. So they invite Juan Perón to come back to Argentina. He becomes president in 1973, and he rules until he dies in 1974 when his wife, who's also his vice president, takes over. However, she is then overthrown in 1976. I also just want to make a note about the armed leftist guerrillas in Argentina. So the government, the military dictatorship, really focused on this as like, this is why we have to do this. The violence is out of control, like completely ignoring, the right-wing guerrillas. But also, there were only about 2,000 armed individuals who were on or involved in these leftist guerrilla groups. However, many were accused of it, and the military dictatorship actually would stage different scenes of staged shootouts to say that, oh, this person was a guerrilla and they tried to kill us, and so we killed them in self-defense. So it's not to say that there weren't armed guerrillas, but they were just not the threat that the military dictatorship made them out to be. So when we talk about the period of state terrorism, it's actually a preferred term by human rights activists. Previously, this period was known as a dirty war. And a dirty war is just when the government conducts war against its own citizens. So certain citizens are considered to be the enemy, right? And they must be eradicated through this counterinsurgency. Dirty wars are characterized by crimes against humanity. And in particular, in Argentina, we see enforced disappearances. And that is where people are taken away by security or military forces, and their families have no idea where they are. And once they're taken to these unknown locations, they often underwent torture, and eventually most of them were killed. It's estimated that there were about 30,000 people who were eventually killed by the military dictatorship in Argentina. There's been some interesting work on the kind of torture that happened in Argentina. It was often characterized as sexual encounters by those who were the perpetrators of torture. Many women were also forced to go on dates with the people who tortured them, like they would take them out to the movies or take them out dancing in these very bizarre situations where after the date, right, they come and electrocute you. And of course, there was sexual assault and rape and all of that. And there's also been a lot of work done on how this violence that's happening in these detention centers also comes to enter the domestic sphere, and we see increased rates of intimate partner violence in Argentina, as well as other places that saw these military dictatorships. Now, the Madres of the Plaza de Mayo, we see them a bit in the film along with the abuelas of the Plaza de Mayo, but basically these were the mothers of disappeared children. They were going from police office to military barracks to different branches of the government, just trying to find out where their children were. And so they started holding weekly protests where they would march and hold signs, and they wear these white headscarves, and the white headscarf is like supposed to signify the diapers that they once dressed their children in. So they did a lot of really important work in drawing attention both domestically and internationally to the issue of enforced disappearances. And it was really a big deal because, all political and civil organizing was banned at this point. So the reason that they move, right, that they walk, is because if they stood still together, then that was considered public assembly, and the government would come try to break them up. Now, some of these women were like, gosh, my daughter, she went in and she was pregnant, or my son's girlfriend, she was enforcibly disappeared and she was pregnant, right? So what happens to these babies? And so that's when we see the rise of the abuelas of the Plaza de Mayo. So there was certainly overlap in membership, right, between the Madres and the abuelas of the Plaza de Mayo, but over time, the abuelas of the Plaza de Mayo become very devoted to locating those children who were stolen from them. So what's notable about both the abuelas and the Madres of the Plaza de Mayo is that they've been organizing for over 40 years. So even though Argentina transitioned to a democracy in 1983, and now is pretty well consolidated as a democracy, they are still organizing. Another group that comes out of the Madres and the Abuelas of the Plaza de Mayo is known as Hijos, which stands for Sons and Daughters for Identity and Justice Against the Forgotten and Silenced. This group doesn't launch until 1995, which I'll talk about why is an important year in a moment. But basically, these are the children who, were like maybe 3 or 4, very young, and had their parents disappeared, right? And so they never got to know their parents very well. Or, they want to find out information about their missing parents. And they're very connected to the madres and the abuelas. So these 3 groups, as well as many other human rights groups, like these are not the only 3 groups in Argentina that were working on these issues, have been really devoted to transitional justice. And transitional justice takes place when a conflict is over or when something, very grave has happened to a country. And it focuses on trying to promote justice. And this is understood in 3 ways. There's retributive justice, which is like, okay, if a crime was committed, we should hold those accountable for these crimes through national trials. Restorative justice is about truth commissions, right? And speaking out, testifying as to what happened to you. And so there's actually, Argentina is one of the first ones to do this truth commission. And they have a report that comes out in 1985 that documents all this testimony and tries to identify how many people were killed. Now that report only identifies 9,000 people. It's far more likely it was much, much higher than that. And most people agree it's probably closer to 30,000. And then reparative justice refers to sort of official policies or, economic reparations for those who have suffered or who were wronged. And Argentina, as I said, is really the leader on transitional justice. So many of the things that they have implemented in Argentina are now influencing the international level. And so the United Nations General Assembly created sort of a process that they recommend that all countries go through. And it was really based a lot on what happened with Argentina. So human rights groups, such as the abuelas, are very resistant to silence, right? They emphasize testimony and speaking truth and holding events to remember this traumatic past so that we can make sure it never happens again, so that we can honor those who were harmed, right? And make sure that we remember them. So this focus on silence is really interesting because I think that comes up a lot in the film. And then along with the article that you read, it really talks about why is it that so many people were vaguely aware, sometimes very aware what was going on, but they stayed silent. So part of it is about personal security. And Diana Taylor has a really interesting book called Disappearing Acts, where she looks at some of this, right? So people would be sitting at a cafe and they would just stare down at their coffee cups so that they wouldn't have to see someone being taken off the streets and enforcibly disappeared, just because they wanted to avoid even dealing with that whole notion. So everyone's turning their heads so that they don't have to even contemplate that thought. And of course, some people were silent because they approved. And I think you can also see that, of course, in the main character's husband, in the film, and some of the quotes from the article, and then as well as the avoidance through veiled language, right? I think that's a really interesting thing to think about as well. So this idea of silence is associated with forgetting, letting everything go into oblivion. But this is really what marked Argentina, especially in the immediate aftermath and the transition to democracy. So it wasn't until 1995 things changed. There's also been a lot of really interesting work on this in terms of this idea of silence and also how silence can speak volumes. And so I think that is something else that's really interesting to think about in the film. Now, what changes, what we call it is a post-memory boom, post-1995 memory boom, is this man, Adolfo Scilingo. He was working in the Navy, and he, in 1995, confesses to the world that, yes, he flew some of the death flights. And what these were is that people who had been tortured for months, right, They were loaded onto a plane, and then their bodies were dumped while they were still alive. They had been drugged so that they wouldn't move, but they would be dumped into the river or into the ocean. And so he confessed on television because he was saying how unfair it was that people who were just, they were in the military, they were just carrying out these orders. Why are they being punished? It's so unfair for them. They're not able to rise in their careers. So he got in big trouble, right? So he's actually been tried in Spain, although at this point he's basically living free there. But this launched this whole period, right? This is when Hijos, the group of the sons and children of those disappeared, they organized kind of in response to this. And we see this just explosion of television shows, novels, memoirs, plays, and poetry, all thinking about this period of terrorism, or this period of state terrorism. And a lot of it is because many people who were too young to remember, who were born after this period, they start asking questions about it. I want to turn now to the abuelas, because this is a very interesting question, and this is where the film ends. So the abuelas have focused really on genetics testing, and this idea that their children who were taken from them, right, their missing grandchildren, like when their children gave birth in the detention centers, their children were stolen. And they're stolen by the regime, and the regime wanted to give them to, quote unquote, respectable families. So these tended to be people who were military families, not all of them, but oftentimes, right? And it was the idea that, well, we couldn't send them back to their grandparents because their grandparents are obviously terrorists and subversives, just the way that their children were. So the abuelas promoted genetics testing to say, find out who you really are. Maybe you're living under false pretenses. And they wanted to recover the one link that they had left to their children who, we now know most of those people who were enforcibly disappeared were killed. So this is their last link to their child. But this whole link between kinship and nationalism is really interesting to think about in this. So the abuelas actually have a saying that's called identity cannot be imposed. And so they basically take it for granted, assuming that everyone has this intrinsic need to know their biological origins, with the understanding that, right, your real identity is your biological origins. And so there are scholars who suggest that the abuelas, not only do they give rise to this idea of genetics research, which has really proliferated, and they really focus, right, on forensic evidence, especially, in identifying the bones of people and saying that, yes, okay, at least now I have the bones of my killed son or daughter. At least I have that. I can have some sense of closure. But they've also really promoted genetics testing to find their stolen grandchildren. And this is also, some people say, pushed this whole adoption rights movement in North America as well, where like people who are adopted feel that they must find out about their biological origins. And so the abuelas also take it for granted that all of these stolen grandchildren want to know, quote unquote, the truth. So Juan Cabandier, he is an example of someone who really resonated with the abuelas. So he was a stolen child, and probably for this very reason, he resonated with this. He was physically abused on a regular basis by his adopted family. So he has, since he found out that he was a stolen child, made the claim, my real parents would never have done this to me. It only could have been someone who's adopted. And so when these beatings were happening, that's what made him realize this is not my real father, because my real father wouldn't do that. Despite the fact, that we know that biological parents do harm their children. It's like 25% of people are dealing with that, at least in the US. So it's very common, right? But this is not something that's unique to him. There are so many testimonies from people who find out that they're these stolen children. And this is exactly what they'll say. I always felt like something was off. I knew it was wrong. Like something in their bodies was telling them this. Now, there's also exceptions to this. So these two twins were one of the earliest cases brought forward by the abuelas. And so they do this DNA testing. They find out that they were stolen children, but they're actually divided. So one of the brothers refuses to acknowledge the biological family. He is devoted to his adopted mother particularly, and then the other brother has really resonated with the biological family. So it's a very interesting case because they're twins, but this was also one of the earliest cases, and it garnered a lot of negative press. And so the press was just like, oh, the psychological trauma and suffering of these guys, finding out their biological origins. And this is very common, right? So for the abuelas, it's a very cut and dry kind of thing, right? The adoptive families, not good. The real, quote unquote, real or biological families, good. But there's ambivalence and guilt from people who are the stolen grandchildren over, and this is all called restitution, right? This is part of that transitional justice. And they feel particularly guilty because it's their DNA that will, put a crime against the parents that raised them, right? And so they don't necessarily feel any connections to their biological families. So there's a lot of very contradictory kind of stories that come out of this process. And so finally, I just want to end by talking about some of Cecilia Sosa's work. She has described Argentina's period of state terrorism as characterized by a whole metaphor of the wounded family. And that is how Argentina as a country is trying to reconcile itself with the period of state terrorism, right? And so we see that with the madres of the Plaza de Mayo, the abuelas of the Plaza de Mayo, hijos, right? And so it's this idea of blood relations as being really dominant in the human rights scene. And she really problematizes that, saying, maybe sometimes it makes some links, but what are the negative impacts of that? So I will end it here.